wanted to have her around for the video, but she's got major zoomies, and she's gonna knock everything over. Can you say bye-bye to the camera? Bye-bye. She's brand new. She's fresh out the womb. Not really. She's like, what are you, 5 months old? 6 months old now? Okay. There's something twisted about Indiana Jones's shadow. It's an iconic shot. A larger-than-life representation of one of film's most charismatic men. It's also the prison that holds the rest of this franchise in its clutches. Everything lives in the shadow of Raiders of the Lost Ark. From its inception to its flaccid finale, this franchise has slowly wilted under the weight of its own potential. Until now. Indiana Jones and the Great Circle is proof that there is something interesting about this man, something left to be written, something that is still winning about this formula. The Great Circle redeemed this franchise as something artistically worthwhile and not just another property for Disney to milk into oblivion. It reminded me why this thing got off the ground in the first place and why I do really love this series. In a lot of ways, Great Circle is a return to form, coming full circle, if you will. It's a return to what makes Indiana Jones interesting and exciting. A return to a time when video games didn't try as hard to be these marketable clusters of genres and were more interesting and unique. It's also a return to Raiders, thematically, a younger Indiana Jones, and a return to the more grounded but still very exciting world of the original trilogy of films. I was not a massive Indiana Jones fan before this game came out. I watched the movies as an early teenager, but I mostly grew up playing the Lego games and playing with the Lego sets. So much that Crystal Skull was actually my favorite one until I watched the movie. Works better in Lego. I actually dressed up as Indiana Jones for Halloween one year before I'd ever watched the films. So I had an eye on Great Circle, but I wasn't necessarily planning to pick it up day one. I wasn't, I was going to wait for a sale, that sort of thing. The reviews came out, they were absolutely spectacular, and I just got really swept up in wanting to experience this world again. So I jumped in, and I immediately fell in love and was so carried by the grandeur of this game that I wanted to rewatch all the movies. So I did, and my first impression was that, whoa, Raiders is that good. It is excellent filmmaking, and there's a reason we talked about it in every film class I took in college. Raiders is electric. Even in 2025, you can still feel the energy of this experiment, and it still feels really exciting that it absolutely nails it on the first go-round. The iconic cast, immediately captivating main character, and the mystical intrigue of this story still hold up today and are all excellent. It is bold, full of mystery, heart, and charm. Temple of Doom is exceptional in its first and third acts, but the middle portion of the temple itself is such a violent tone shift that kind of disrupts the film. There's a reason it is largely responsible for the creation of the PG-13 rating. But the end result is something a little jarring and a little too dissonant to be remembered as one cohesive whole, and I think it suffers for that, but I admire the bold swing. The film is really funny in its less grotesque moments, but overall the impression is the temple itself and just how heavy it is. But I think it is far above the most interesting Indiana Jones film. It's the kind of stuff I love to see from a sequel. After that, The Last Crusade plays it pretty safe, sticking pretty close to the ground that Raiders trod, but missing the electric feeling of that film. The excitement of the original film discovering itself is missing, but this one's still very enjoyable. The father-son adventure adds a fun wrinkle to the formula, and the biblical quest is a nice callback to Raiders, and it's got some pretty cool sequences. If it weren't the last good entry in the franchise, I think I'd have a higher opinion of it, but that's a pretty unfortunate cross to bear. Crystal Skull is just a bad film. It's incredible to me how bad it actually is in comparison. It's really mired in being a soft revival of the franchise at the dawn of a new era of filmmaking. Because some of the scenes have that classic Spielberg style with crisp shadows accentuating the tone and the tension, but there's also a ton of shots that just look like 2008. And that shift between the two visual identities is really jarring. And a lot of the action ends up being really drawn out because of it. So many of the sequences are just contrived to make things work instead of flowing as naturally as the other films do. And the film is so dedicated to sticking to the Indiana Jones formula that it locks itself away from the magic of discovery, which is the core of this franchise. It does have some really interesting ideas, but ultimately fumbles most of them pretty spectacularly. And overall, it just feels rigid. It is a slave to the task of recapturing the original magic, which is a pointless struggle. Then I watched Dial of Destiny. I was pretty excited for this one because I have not seen it yet. I missed it in theaters because, well, okay, reviews weren't that good, but I had heard that it was better than Crystal Skull, but I didn't know anything else besides the fact that they de-aged Harrison Ford for a little bit of it and that my king Mads Mikkelsen was in it. Not much more to it than that. From a production standpoint, this is an entirely different kind of movie than the previous four. It is unmistakably, uninterestingly, and unfortunately, a 2023 Disney movie. Action shots are far too close to see real motion, sets are too dark to make out any detail, and there are too many cuts to follow the choreography. It's a boring style of action shooting that mimes sustained tension instead of using light and movement, the paint to film's canvas, to attract the eye and tell a story. I don't think Indiana Jones always has to look like Spielberg, but nothing should look like this. And unfortunately, the plot is just as dull as the action, as the main intrigue of the film is played out in the first hour of its grueling 2-hour, 37-minute runtime. And I don't know if I really need to talk about this, but Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character, I recently watched through all of Fleabag, and Phoebe Waller-Bridge's character has a similar kind of flirtatious and sassy vibe. So the entire time I was watching it, I was thinking, oh, that's Fleabag, notorious sex fiend and fourth wall breaker, and now Indiana Jones's goddaughter. Not a problem with the film. I had to share. Above all, this movie kills me because it isn't outright bad like Crystal Skull, but it's so bland and ironically unadventurous, but it was so close to being something fascinating. It may not be the worst Jones film, but it is my least favorite. Then I watched Timeless Heroes, a new documentary on the franchise, its legacy, and Harrison Ford's role in shaping it. It was really lovely to watch the team talk about the original trilogy and the rush it caused in Hollywood and the lives of the people involved. And then it was crushing to watch the discussion of Dial of Destiny, because if I hadn't already seen it, this documentary would have convinced me that it was a good film. Because they talk a lot about the ideas in the process, and a lot of those ideas were really good. The execution was not. It should have been really interesting to look at this man and how he grapples with the end of his time, with the decisions that he's made, and how this world is moving past him. One of the coolest ideas that goes nowhere is the space race, and how it eclipses everything Jones has ever discovered or worked on, because the public is enraptured by this journey to the stars, but archaeology never had this kind of global fanaticism. The main villain is an astrophysicist, former Nazi and current US NASA scientist responsible for the Apollo moon landing, which is an awesome thematic element, but it never has relevance. It never matters, it's never developed or utilized to any sort of effect with the characters. It's just there, and you're supposed to think it's clever. And then putting Jones into a divorce makes sense. I mean, seems kind of inevitable, but he and Marion get back together at the end of the film for the sake of a happy ending, which is pretty much the same trick you pulled in the last film, except less. This is how much space that takes up on the Wikipedia plot summary. None of these points on the plot are bad ideas because there is a lot of space to invent and write about this character, but the movie never takes these opportunities. Honestly, it just feels like the director, James Mangold, was trying to fix Crystal Skull. It's got a lot of the same themes, but blander. But above all, what killed me about the documentary is that the major ending note is that only Harrison Ford can play Indiana Jones. It's just not true, and it's a disservice to everyone on the project to say that it is. No discredit to Harrison Ford's work, because without a doubt, he defined that character, and is certainly a massive part of why this idea landed in the first place. He is perfect for the role, and he is the definition of who Indiana Jones is, but I see no reason why nobody else can come and lift up that work. That's what actors do. The character has already been created. Nobody else has to or gets to do that work again. It is now about embodying this character, stepping into it. And I'm not saying that this franchise needs to go on till the end of time, casting new actors over and over and over, but I'm just saying that it doesn't have to die with the guy. I can't say that. I'm just saying that it doesn't have to end with Ford. There is still something worthwhile about this property, and other people are capable of that work. Troy Baker is not who I would have called to play Indiana Jones. I love his work, but I guess with as popular as he is, I've kind of forgotten how good he is, and when I hear him in a game, unless he's doing a character voice, I'm more cognizant of the fact that, oh, that's Troy Baker than the character. And Todd Howard shared a similar thought, it seems, because he said this that I'm going to put on the clip.
Todd Howard, our executive producer at Bethesda, was like, no, I'm not putting Troy Baker in my game. I don't want Troy Baker in my game.
He has really outdone himself here. His young Harrison impression is uncanny because it's not exactly the tone or quality of his voice that are replicated the most. They are. But such a deep mimicry of his delivery, the intonation, the tone, the pacing and pauses, it is all characteristically Indiana Jones.
Where's the stone, you American rat?
Stone? What stone?
Even the motion capture looks like early Jones, which not even Dial of Destiny's de-aged Ford can accomplish. But Baker doesn't stop with just putting on a costume of Harrison Ford. He genuinely taps into the same person of Indiana Jones. The way he thinks, feels, acts, it's all the same. It is not just a surface-level imitation of Indiana Jones, but an internal replication. It is really, really good acting. In an interview with Gameology, he talks about this process and how difficult it was to tap into. But ultimately, what helped guide him through it was not trying to convince the audience that he was Indiana Jones, but rather convincing the player that they are Indiana Jones, that you are Indiana Jones. And as a video game, it has this convenient ability to be able to manufacture this abstraction of Indiana Jones that isn't exactly Harrison Ford's face, but some sort of illustration of him within the idea of Indiana Jones. And the voice feels the same, where it isn't just trying to perfectly emulate that sound, but it captures all of what Harrison Ford brought to the character. It's a quintessential extraction of the character.
I don't suppose you know how to fly this thing, do you?
Excuse me?
Nothing. Just might have a little trouble with the leg, that's all.
And this package makes it really easy to step into the shoes of this person and feel like you are Indiana Jones. And then this character is put into a lot of interesting situations, some that tie him back to Raiders, not focusing on, but casually integrating his feelings for Marion into his character and into the story, and then foreshadowing Crusade with pointed jabs at his relationship with his father, all in between a spectacular new adventure. They don't add any major lore to the character or change anything fundamental about him, they just flesh out things that are already there, which made me realize just how much there is waiting to be written. Dial of Destiny is so upsetting to me because it was so close to being interesting, but it ultimately settled for surface level symbolism. One of the things that defines the original set of films is the odd sense of realism. Obviously, this universe kind of bends around Jones. It is conveniently set up so that dominoes fall at just the right time for just the right people. Cars are exactly where they need to be for chase scenes. Jones always has just enough time to get through a closing door. And so when the mystical side of the quest appears, like in Raiders when the Ark of the Covenant is opened, it still feels plausible, like it could technically still happen in our world. There's a question to be asked. The first three films all have this energy of not quite believing just up until whatever it is happens. But starting with Crystal Skull, sci-fi fantasy starts to rule, and it just becomes less interesting. Then in Dial of Destiny, spoilers for a movie that you truly do not need to bother watching, time travel is the name of the game, which I could let slide. That makes sense. I mean, eternal life was the thing in Crusade. But the problem is that it's not the big reveal at the end. It's not the question. Nobody's really concerned if. Nobody's concerned if you can time travel. But you know exactly what this magic artifact does, and you know to believe it early on in the movie. And then the rest of it is just this annoying globe-trotting MacGuffin hunting. There's not a quest so much as a script. And then the final twist, what would have been the final twist if the mystery wasn't exposed an hour prior, is the evil plan is time travel. Go back in time and be better at Hitler stuff than Hitler was. And that's fine. That's what I would want and expect from an Indiana Jones character. It's just a little disappointing when there's nothing left to reveal. Except for the movie's final twist, which is admittedly actually pretty cool. Indiana Jones et al. Are time traveled back to 212 BC Rome because continental drift and the coordinates were wrong. But this results in the movie's most interesting idea. Jones is shot and wants to stay behind and die in ancient Rome because he is finally experiencing history. He is in the past that he has been chasing his whole life, and he can abandon the future, the present that he is constantly running from. But this conflict is not built up throughout the rest of the film. It's hinted at, it's got some surface level symbolism to it, and it could have been the most interesting challenge this character ever faced, but it is never invested in, and it is resolved stupidly and simply. But I digress. This was supposed to be a video about the Great Circle. I've talked about part of why the Great Circle works so well in junction with the films, because the cutscene direction and the narrative writing feel both so superbly Indiana Jones in the way that the cutscenes are directed like Spielberg, and that the writing just gets what is interesting about Dr. Henry Jones. Mechanically, the game also really gets it. Moment-to-moment gameplay is far more archaeology than action-adventure, which is excellent. There are plenty of fights to be had, plenty of ruins to explore, and stunts to be done, but the focus on the Dr. Jones side is really refreshing. Trailers and marketing did not really sell this game because in motion it kind of looks like a first-person Uncharted, but that's absolutely not the case. It makes sense that as a counterpart to the films, which are naturally brisker in pace, that it is a game that is allowed to expound on these slower moments that are just as much part of Indiana Jones and his life and passion. The game does a really good job of communicating Jones's adoration of history and of other cultures. The breadth of languages that he knows has always been part of his character, but it feels a little more natural here. Communicates respect more than knowledge, owing a lot to Baker's acting.
From Yakshan. Sanskrit for giants. Shunka.
As cliche as it is to say, the way the game is structured really makes you feel like Indiana Jones, rather than like you're playing an Indiana Jones movie, which is what most movie games try to do, and I think this really enhances the experience. The gameplay is really hard to fit into narrow categories and genres. It's a lot of things bundled together in a way that I haven't really seen before. The action is really fun, especially because the pace of the combat feels like I'm choreographing a fight, punch by punch, just like the way that the plane fight in Raiders of the Lost Ark was choreographed on the day of shooting. But solving puzzles and decoding ciphers more than busting skulls and discovering lost cities is way more intimate and accurate to the experience of being Indiana Jones. There are a ton of these locked chests with 4-digit codes that require you to solve some sort of logic puzzle, riddle, or cipher. I used a physical journal to help keep track of a lot of this stuff, and it really felt like I was decoding something real rather than just solving an arbitrary video game puzzle. And because of this gentler focus, we get a lot more insight into the character of Jones, not just the figure or the idea. The inevitable romance with Gina is also surprisingly interesting because it is tinged with the recent Marion fiasco. The game takes place only a year after their re-encounter in Raiders, and this complicates and gets in the way of this new romance, and that's apparent even to Gina, which adds another interesting layer. None of these ideas are especially novel in the grand scheme of storytelling, but the presentation here is so rich because it's offered in this longer form story that has the luxury to slow down and sit with it. We get to see so much granular detail in the characters, so much intimate mundanity that feels really authentic to life and consistent with the characters defined by the films. This focus on a more immersive experience is ultimately what makes this game work so well, and why it's one of the best video games in the last few years, and why it's an interesting Indiana Jones game. The mechanical choices don't just make for a novel gameplay experience, but also highlight underserviced aspects of the concept of Indiana Jones that really do shine. The narrative and gameplay work in tandem to provide something that feels like more than a good extension of the property the way that most movie games do. Even the best Star Wars game feels like a good video game version of what is appealing about Star Wars, but not essential. The Great Circle genuinely feels like an important and essential chapter of the Indiana Jones saga, of equal importance to any of the films, and arguably more relevant and worthwhile than Crystal Skull or Dial of Destiny. If I had just marathoned the movies, I think I would feel pretty down about the whole premise of Indiana Jones. Like it was a flash in the pan that hit like lightning at first, but the magic never really stuck around. Without this game, after Dial of Destiny, I think I would have said just shut the doors. This franchise, this character have nothing left to offer. But The Great Circle is a collection of the best parts of Indiana Jones, expanded upon with a lavish labor of love. The Great Circle feels like this franchise finding its way again, proving that it is possible to make something good with this idea without just banking on nostalgia and old ideas. To me, at least, it is proof that the idea of Indiana Jones is still special, that it hasn't been tapped dry, just misunderstood and mishandled in recent years. And someday, not now, I think the current state of Disney entirely misunderstands this franchise, but someday I'd like to see a triumphant return to the silver screen with new faces, new production, a new actor, with the same old Indiana Jones that we all love. Early on, I talked about how the electricity of Raiders of the Lost Ark was missing in The Last Crusade. I think a lot of why Raiders is still arguably the best Indiana Jones film is because it is a story about discovery while also being an act of discovery itself. This was such uncharted territory when Raiders was being produced, and every film following in its footsteps would struggle to capture that electricity because they weren't charting a new course, they were following in footsteps that had already been trodden. But what the Great Circle is truly able to accomplish, above every other triumph it has, is capturing that electricity. This video game, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, calls upon old ideas. Where Raiders called back on serial adventure films, The Great Circle calls back on an equally old era of film and an old era of game design. But none of these inspirations hold it back. Neither the film nor this game are held back by the past that they're reverent to. They both chart an incredible, pioneering adventure that many will be sure to follow in the future. Indiana Jones inspired a number of incredibly popular franchises, and if Great Circle gets half the recognition it deserves, I expect to see some poor imitations in a few years. I worry that perhaps this reinvigoration of Indiana Jones will be subject to the same curse as the films, always living in the shadow of the first one. But I also get a comforting feeling of reassurance from the game, because it is an act of rediscovering this franchise. It's comforting to know that there are other people out there who do get it. So maybe they can get it again. I don't know if MachineGames will get to make another Indiana Jones game. I don't know if they will even want to. But if it does happen, I think it's in pretty good hands, and I feel pretty confident about the project. But if it does suffer the same curse as the films, nothing can tarnish this one. Raiders is still my favorite after all these years, and I can't imagine myself not loving this game. Above all, though, this game gives me hope that in a few decades, an entirely new team can rise from nowhere and put Indiana Jones back on the silver screen with the same electricity that he once had. Thanks for watching. It's just really, it's said this that I'm gonna put on this, the clip. Neither idea were